Hello everybody and welcome to my talk. My name is Maischein and I'd like to tell you a bit today about reading CPAN and finding modules. A short overview of what I'm going to tell you. Well, first I will try to find out or try to tell you that you can find out whether this talk will even help you or not. Then I'll show you how you can find modules that maybe solve your problem. We will take a short look at installing those modules and then what you need to actually use modules. A bit about me. My name is Maischein and I work for the DZ Bank in Frankfurt. It's the Deutsche Zentralgenossenschaftsbank. You don't know it, but it's the central bank of the cooperative banks in Germany. And I am a data scientist there. So yeah, I'm not officially a programmer, but yeah, I do some Perl on the side.
Are you hiring?
No, we are not hiring, at least not that I'm aware of. Oh, yeah. The leitmotif for this talk is experience is something you need most when you have it least. So yeah, you will see how that plays into actually selecting a module from CPAN to use with your problem. Now, for the audience. The audience is obviously you, and hopefully this talk is actually useful for you, or at least a part of you, and ideally a large part of you. One part of this talk is for programmers, you know, how to program. And yeah, maybe you didn't install a module yourself or didn't have a module installed for you, but somebody comes to you and you need to suggest a module to use with a problem. Yeah, or you need to find which modules are actually suitable for some kind of problem. On the other side, maybe you are a module author. The stream is bugging out somehow, or the okay, yeah, I'll stand like this. Yeah. So yeah, I'll try not to step on the cable anymore. Sorry. Yeah, so if you are a module author, this talk maybe helps you to improve the domain-specific parts of your module, especially the documentation, so that people can better find your module and better actually install your module so it can see use outside of your machine. And yeah, in general, as a module author, I hope you find inspiration in this talk on how to improve your documentation and usability of your module. Now, what am I not going to do or talk about in this talk? Well, first of all, I won't present a fixed list of known good modules, because that's maybe what task Kensho is for. But I'm not really sure what the correct module or the best module to use is for your situation. So you have to find that out yourself. I'm also trying to avoid publicly rating modules. But I want to give you the tools that I found useful for actually evaluating modules and deciding on modules and whether to try them out or not. I've used this fancy Unicode emoji for marking things that I think are too much my opinion. So yeah, you should be aware that items marked with this are maybe up for this debate, or other people might strongly disagree. Yeah, in general, this talk is intended as decision assistance for CPAN. Now, just in case any of you leaves early, the result will be that domain knowledge beats about everything else. You can't really decide on what module to use if you haven't understood the problem and the different approaches that exist for the problem you have. And yeah, so you will have to learn about the domain you are attacking before you can decide, or before you can properly decide on a module that you're going to use to solve this problem. Yeah, CPAN itself is then just the way of getting the module, but you have a lot of work to do beforehand. So what is the problem that you have? Well, the problem is somebody comes to you and says, we need X, and X might be single sign-on, or maybe XML, or some other buzzword, or whatever other problem might happen. I didn't step on the cable. And obviously, we use Perl, so there surely is something on CPAN. Or the question that you ask yourself is, isn't there something on CPAN? So yeah, the basic steps I found very useful are to collect domain knowledge about whatever problem you are encountering. Then to evaluate the modules, install the modules, and hopefully then also use the modules you've installed. Yeah. Tom, you are getting up. Should I? Okay, so it's just between me and the beamer projector. So. Okay, but it should have switched down to 1080. Yeah, full HD. Okay. Okay, so yeah, it's the beamer. It's not me. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, how can you collect domain knowledge? Well, you have to learn about the domain that your problem exists in. That means, to me, always finding the places where discussion of this domain happens, like maybe on a mailing list, or there is some central website, or maybe a Facebook group. And recently I've also found discourse groups or Telegram groups where people gather to talk about the problems they have with some environment or whatever. And yeah, then you have to review the existing approaches to the problem. And ideally, there are existing programs and maybe even existing documentation. And I always find it helpful to read documentation, even if I'm not using the program or will never use the program. Most likely, the documentation mentions some important things that should never happen, or some problems that this software works around in a grandiose way. So then I already know what kind of problems exist in the domain or are perceived as important within that domain. And yeah, if there are existing libraries, that's great, because then you get to review those as well to decide which the best library is to attack the problem. Yeah, this is where karma strikes. If you are lucky, you get more than one alternative. If you have bad luck, you get more than two alternatives. Because if you want to make a good decision, yeah, you want to have taken a short look at every possible solution. But yeah, maybe you are good at throwing darts or whatever to find any solution that works. So what are the questions, or some questions about domain knowledge? I often look for standard test cases or standard use cases in the domain like for example for JavaScript frameworks, there is the to-do application, which is not a great example, but it's an example that basically every JavaScript framework implements. And so that gives you a shallow overview of how each framework compares, or at least some kind of baseline. And if there is a JavaScript framework that doesn't implement the to-do application, certainly that framework is the odd one out. So that still might be a candidate for evaluation, but it doesn't follow the JavaScript customs, which might give you pause or encourage you to use it, but you have to decide on that yourself. Also important to me is when was the last change to that domain and to that API, because there are some really quickly evolving APIs where the last version that's deprecated now was released half a year ago. And there are some other domains or APIs that really haven't changed since TCP was the way of connecting between computers. So that's also something I tend to keep in mind, especially for how mature I can expect the solutions to actually be. I've mentioned the different approaches in domains. For example, you have automatic transmission and manual transmission in cars as one example for two different approaches to actually address a problem. Or when XML parsing, you have the SEX approach of basically event-driven parsing, and the DOM approach, which is great when you can fit your whole document into a working set of memory. So both are very viable approaches, but you need to have understood the problem of needing too much memory before you can decide whether a SEX approach or a DOM approach is the correct one for you. Or with databases, the document-oriented approach or the relational approach are examples for really different approaches to storing data. After you've asked yourself these questions and hopefully found the general approaches in the domain that exist, hopefully you can find Perl-specific libraries, or if these don't exist, any libraries, or maybe ideas for such libraries. Usually I try first to Google the search terms of the domain without Perl, and then again with Perl, and hopefully something turns up. Maybe it is a library that is recommended or railed against, or at least maybe some new keywords that I did miss before, so I have something more to work with. And then I look on MetaCPAN with those same keywords again, in the hope that Elasticsearch can find something for me that matches those keywords. Or maybe Stack Overflow has some recommendation on libraries or modules that address my problem. Now we get to the hard part of actually evaluating a module, because maybe we have found one or two or three modules that address or claim to address the problem. I don't do this anymore, but on perlmonks.org, a website I am on, asking the question of should I use the module or approach Y or Z for doing X, will likely not give you helpful answers because nobody really understands your situation and the constraints you are working in. On other websites, you might get no reasonable person wants to do X at all. Or on Stack Overflow, your question will be closed as opinion or too much discussion. And yeah, again, on Perlmonks.org, you will also get mostly the question back, what problem do you actually want to solve? So ideally, instead of asking the internet this question, you ask yourself the question of what problem do you actually want to solve in terms of what are your constraints? Do you have a multi-petabyte RAM machine so you can just load everything into RAM? Or does it need to work on a mobile phone or whatever so that you can supply just enough information for those people who might know an answer for you? If you look at past discussions of a topic, also look at the date of that discussion and compare it to the date when the last meaningful change in the API was or something. Maybe a discussion of XML in 1999 or 2003 where somebody said that eats too much RAM isn't actually relevant in 2018 when you get multi-gigabyte machines for really cheap money. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind as well, that old discussions may simply not apply today anymore. So yeah, then comes this step of actually evaluating the library itself, comparing the test suite of the library against, if you have found anything like that, the standard test cases, for example, for some web framework or something that claims to do secure HTTP forms or safe HTTP forms. Does it test itself against the OWASP test suite, or is there a discussion of the OWASP test suite? Or if it is a re-implementation of OpenSSL, does it use similar test cases or ideally the test suite of OpenSSL? Yeah, I've already talked about this. JavaScript frameworks have their to-do app. That is the standard implementation example. Yeah, also, again, relevant thing is when was the last change to the module and when was the last change to the API. On CPAN there are some Google modules that are like 10 years old. They are highly unlikely to still work anymore because either Google has since retired these APIs or changed how they function at all, or if it was a module that scraped a website within the last 10 years, most likely that website has also changed in a way that the module will not work anymore. A good example of this is MIME-Lite. Its author says, don't use this module anymore, I don't support it. And the last release was in 2013, but the last meaningful change to email in general, I don't know. Well, we have somebody here who has worked in the field of email, but I'm guessing that maybe 2005 with the DKIM stuff or something, but the way that email was formatted and anything didn't change since the introduction of MIME emails. So yeah, that doesn't rule out MIME-Lite to me, but on the other hand, in the cases I use it, it works for me. If the author already says, I don't support this anymore, then yeah, well, maybe you should start with something else instead of MIME-Lite. you should also take a look at the bugs that have accumulated in the bug tracker. Nick, yes?
The other one was if there's an open development list, which is archived, is there any activity on the development list?
Oh, yes. If there is, back to, old modules and modules, module release dates in general, are there developers that are actually actively working on the module? Or, if it's an older module or a module without any recent release, the chance isn't that low that nobody is actively maintaining it anymore. That leads nicely to the amount of unaddressed bugs in the bug tracker. If you take a look at the bug tracker of a library and there are just bug reports piling up without any reply from the maintainer, that's a bad sign. But I also like to look at the closed bugs of a bug tracker, because maybe the author just closes any bug for a want fix reason, or I don't know, this operating system or something. But not every open or unaddressed bug might be relevant for you. If there are people who have problems installing the module on Windows, that might not apply to you if you are working with Linux only, or vice versa. So you need to use your own judgment for the quality of these bugs. Maischein. Yes, what?
Because if there's no bugs and the author is very responsive and he closes it the next day with the fix, it's a good one.
Yes, what Maischein said is the time between a reported bug and the closing of the bug by the author is relevant, because a very active module maintainer could reply very quickly and fix the bug or explain the behavior very quickly, which also obviously closes a bug very quickly and leads to a zero defect badge, and is a good sign for our library, yes. Also, in this respect, what I dislike is GitHub now offering automatically closing bugs within 6 months of no activity, which simply hides or sweeps under the carpet such problems. So yes, looking at the closed issues certainly is important. Also, the closed issues, or even the open issues, will tell you a bit about the problems that users of a library actually encounter. Like, I don't know, maybe for OpenSSL or something, that the file permissions need to be correct for the private key files or stuff like that. And most likely this is less a library problem, but more a problem of the usage of the library. But if people find it problematic to even get started with a library, the closed bugs maybe contain the small changes you need to make in your toy program to try it out to get to a successful first run. Besides the bug tracker, there's also the module documentation. And with Perl, there are pod sections like the name, the abstract, the synopsis, and the see also sections. No module needs to have any of these, but ideally a module has all of these, at least, if not more. And I'll talk a bit about these. The name is just the name of the module. And yeah, if you have kids, you know how it is. You give the module a name, and you give that name likely to put it in a long tradition of similar names that you already gave or already encountered. The other thing a name ideally would be is that it describes you accurately, but that's usually not something that you know when naming the kid or the module already. So yeah, finding a good name is hard, but usually the good name only appears after 2 or 3 years of usage. So yeah. There are some families on CPAN, like the Acme family. If a module is named Acme, it might contain a core of interesting techniques, but I would never use, well, I would, I don't want to say I would never use an Acme module in production, but yeah, using an Acme module would be a very last resort, and I think I would rather copy the interesting part of the Acme module into a serious module instead, and then use my serious module. Yeah, I was in response to yesterday's lightning talk about the SYNOPSIS monkey operator. I was about to write that as a source filter, but yeah, it's either a trivial source filter or a surprisingly hard source filter, so I'm not convinced that it would be fun to write. So yeah, for example, such filters that introduce Unicode strictly belong in the Acme family. Originally, I was going to rant about modules that carry simple in their name, because my rant was going to be that they usually are simple in nothing but the name, like XML simple, which claims to make XML simple, but XML is simple until it isn't, and you only find out too late that you've maneuvered yourself into a rewrite of your program. And filter simple also falls in this category, but this rant would be quite unkind to other modules like LWP simple, which makes the simple part of HTTP actually simple, and you can migrate from the simple part to the more complex part in a not too painful way. And keyword simple is not a simple module, and keywords themselves are not simple, but it greatly simplifies the task of actually implementing a new keyword for Perl. So yes, not every module with simple in its name deserves the dung of heap of dung I was to heap on it. So yeah. Module names I like more are tiny. Usually those modules implement or also implement just a restricted feature set, but they also usually document what hard parts they are leaving out. And if you have enough knowledge about your domain, you should already know whether you can use a tiny module that doesn't implement some feature, because you don't need that feature anyway. So I would always prefer a tiny module over a simple module in my first approach of evaluating libraries. Yeah, the abstract is a single line description of a module, and I've brought some examples. For example, Kavorka is a name that doesn't really tell you anything, but maybe the abstract tells you a bit more. It's function signatures with the lure of the animal. I'm not sure whether that's, well, it tells me at least the module is something about function signatures. So yeah. Then data dumper, which might be a bit long, but on the other hand, I find it actually tells me what it is about. Stringified Perl data structures suitable for both printing and eval, which, yeah, at least if you know what data dumper does, you can recognize that here again. And yeah, my own abstract for filter signatures, very simplistic subroutine signatures for Perl below 520. I'm not sure that this is a really great abstract, but at least it mentions simplistic, which by now should discourage you from actually using this module without knowing what it does. And it also mentions subroutine signatures. So yeah, hopefully that could tell you what the module does. It implements subroutine signatures for Perl versions that don't have native subroutine signatures yet. The most interesting section in pod documentation to me is the synopsis. It should show the simplest use of the module possible, or at least show the use of the module within 5 to 10 lines of source code. And ideally, you can cut and paste that into a small program, maybe add some trivial or obvious configuration, and have a working program. So yeah, the synopsis is always something I aim to try out first, because that was what the author thought was the best and intended use of the module. So yeah, if this doesn't work, then either I don't understand what the author meant, or maybe something is wrong with my setup. And yes, the see also section is also something that I really like to look at. It is where the author usually left a set of links that are considered required reading or other interesting information, or maybe the API documentation that the module actually accesses. So yes, reading the stuff in this also section is something I really like to do. Now, if we look at metacpan.org, the web front end of CPAN, for distribution, we get a lot of links. And for example, the bug tracker is usually linked from metacpan.org. So we can easily access it and look at the number of open bugs and the closed bugs, and of course the kinds of problems that people encountered. Also important and often only addressed afterwards are the processual dependencies of modules and libraries, like the license. Not everybody can use a GPL licensed library, because then maybe, or depending on what their lawyers say, they might have to actually distribute the source code of their application. And also the licenses of the dependencies of the libraries. And you can somewhat check this from the license field on metacpan.org. And for the transitive licenses, I think you should or could access the metacpan API to actually get a tree of required licenses for all the modules you use. some modules simply don't work everywhere. Some modules really want an API key and or want to store that API key with some specific service, like maybe if you want to do SSH access to other systems and your company policy requires that there are passwords on all the SSH keys, you will need something like SSH agent or some other mechanism to let your SSH clients connect to other machines. So yeah, if a module or library can't, for example, work with SSH agent or whatever other mechanism you have for key distribution, this won't work. Also, some libraries might rely on system programs or maybe operating system APIs like Win32 or AIX. So even though it has a great API and good documentation, the library might simply not work on your operating system, or maybe the library needs a C compiler or something at runtime, and maybe you aren't allowed to have C compilers on the production machines. So there are things beyond Perl that can still trip up your good selection. Or something might need online access during installation, which might also not happen or not be available. And yeah, you should also look at the interaction between modules, like if you have a source filter, does it play well with other source filters, and other problems between modules, or maybe one module author does not like the way another module author does things and patches their module if they detect it's loaded. So yeah, there are pitfalls to consider. On a more general level of interoperability, I really like to look at how all-encompassing a solution is. Like, does the library or does the framework expect that all objects derive from a common ancestor? Like, does the library bring its own base class with it and expects you to derive all your objects from that base class? Or for C libraries, do you need to have all the strings to be of the string type that this C, or no, that's more a C++ problem, but do all strings have to be of the string object type of that library? And also, how much of the library do you need to use? That's a very related question. Can I just start with the URL rewriter, or do I have to use their config module to actually load the config in their own config file format before I can use this framework? Yeah, so also, does this framework bring its own event loop with it, and how does this event loop play with my event loop? And maybe even, do I need to use threads, and does this C library actually play well with threads? So now you have finally decided on a library to try out or module, and you want to go installing it. But before you install it, you should check whether it is already installed, because why reinstall what is already installed? You can find that by using perl.doc-l and then the module name. And yeah, if it's not found, you will get an error message. If you don't have perl-doc installed, because some distributions strip perl-doc from the Perl distribution, you can also use this one-liner to load a module. And yeah, if it fails, Perl will tell you that. And if you have a nice sysadmin, they might have installed the V module for you, so you can shorten this one-liner to a shorter one-liner, and this will tell you both the path where a file is installed, a module is installed, and its version. And if all of this fails, you can use CPAN-L, which will list all installed modules, and then you can grab for whatever pattern you hope to find. Some remarks for module authors. Every step that a user has to take to install your modules roughly halves the number of people who will complete the process. This must be true because I read it on the internet. But yeah, you should look at how much configuration a user needs to do before they can install or successfully install your program or module, and how much they need to do to get a successful initial run that basically tells them, yes, this module basically works. Ideally, obviously, there are no additional steps beyond installing from CPAN, but some modules require you to go into the test suite and patch a username and password into that. You could make that easier by allowing an environment variable, for example, so that people can set the environment variable and then run the CPAN installation, or something like that. Ideally, you also provide ready-to-install packages, especially if the CPAN module has outside dependencies like on a C library or something, then the package for your CPAN module can also list the outside C library as a prerequisite. For bonus points, you could also provide step-by-step installation documentation. I've created mine by copy and pasting some emails together that I wrote to users in how they can fix their installation. And that gave me at least a good starting point to get a set of steps together that other people might need to follow. And what really improved the installability of modules on OS X was getting Travis CI running, because Travis CI can run my test suite on OS X, and trying to do that forced me to find out what the invocations on OS X are to actually launch programs like I want. And for Windows, there's AppWare, which also runs the test suite of your module for you and sends you an email with the test results. And if the test suite runs, then the chances aren't that bad that users can also install it. So something more about installation. Depending on your ecosystem, you may think that some modules are always there, but they are usually not. Strawberry Perl includes a lot of modules that are not available elsewhere by default. Red Hat goes the other way and doesn't include modules. And Active State is more like Strawberry Perl by also including DBI and some other modules. In my opinion, you should always list all of your direct prerequisites in the makefile.pl or build.pl files, so that your module works across all flavors of Perl distributions. Well, installing a module now basically reduces to reading the install file and the README file, hopefully following the instructions there, like you need to make sure that other client libraries are installed. There is a link on Meta CPAN, which has been pushed below this black bar here, sorry, that displays install information, but this information seems to be very generic. Install this by launching CPAN and then type install module name, which isn't bad, but I would find it much better if there was a way for module authors to actually link to their installation information for this module. But yeah. A short bit about installing module, but looking at the audience, I don't think it's that relevant to you. The easiest way is to not install it because it is already installed, or to get somebody else to install the module for you. And then in ascending order of perceived hardness is to use the package manager of your operating system to install the module, or to use local lib with the CPAN client, or Perl brew to compile your own Perl and then use the CPAN client with it, or to go the bare bones way of compiling your own Perl and using the CPAN with it. There is in the bonus section for every one of these variants a short example on how you actually do this. And finally, for using the module, well, hopefully you already know enough about the domain, so you can just read the documentation and the examples that come with the library, and the links in the documentation, because that is what the author thought would help you with the module. And that's what I already said, the documentation. And if all else fails, read the source code of the module. Maybe there are some hidden comments or hidden functions that will actually help you. And of course, you can always ask the author. I find it always nice to have contact with users of my modules. That tells me that I'm not writing this just for myself, but other people also find it helpful. And yes, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. We have some minutes left, so comments and questions. Maischein.
Don't be frightened by failing tests at first. Authors are not always very good test writers, so it might fail using wrong constants that pass on their machine, but not when it compiles with -t use long doubles. It might fail on different architectures, while the test it runs fine. The architecture returns something else, little endian versus big endian. So not all tests are right.
Yeah.
So failing a module might work fine, but the test is wrong.
Yeah, well, for the viewers at home, what Maischein said, failing tests are not necessarily a problem of the library being bad. It could also well be the case that the tests themselves are bad, in the sense of relying on stuff that is only on the author's machine and not on your machine. So if you have a module that looks really good for you, then maybe trying it out despite failing the tests is still an option. Nick?
Slightly startling, because then if you're able to send the author a bug report with a fix for the failing tests, you can assess how good they are at
Yes.
Nick suggested sending a bug report to the author just to also assess how good they are in responding and fixing their module for outside reports. You had also a question.
I was just wondering, obviously you're showing sort of experience how to work with C you have
Yes.
any views on things like Kensho or any ideas on a way to improve the findability of modules? I mean,
Do I have ideas on improving the findability of modules? Not really, because assessing the problem is the hard thing. I mean, there are situations where XML simple can just work, even though I still would not recommend it. But if you know enough about the structure of your incoming data, XML simple could just be enough, even though I would never expect it to be on a list of recommended modules. And also, I work a lot with XML, and we have XML files that are compressed 40 megabytes, and they expand to like 300 megabytes, no, 40, is it? No, compressed 40 megabytes, and I think they expand to 200 gigabyte in RAM, which is okay, or which we ignore, because the machine this runs on has 400 gigabytes of RAM. So it shares that with the database, but while the XML is processed, the database doesn't have to do anything. So there, the approach of using libxml simply works. But on a smaller machine, and it doesn't have to be that much smaller, you would need to switch, or you should switch to something like XML Twig or a sex parser. So I'm not sure whether that list of recommended modules doesn't include all options, and then you are no step further than you already are on CPAN.
Check to see there isn't always a rating for stuff.
Look at the date of the rating.
Yeah, well, you've got the rating and the module version of the rating, so you've got the date and
Because the rating doesn't change if that problem has been fixed in a later version.
absolutely, so you need to.
So it might have a very low rating, but all the problems have been fixed in recent versions.
Sure, so you need to check, you need to ensure that the version of the module you're looking at is still relevant to the ratings that are there. So, good to fix, but.
Okay, are there any more questions? Because we have run out of time. If you have any comments, I'm still here this evening, so feel free to come up to me. Thank you.